The sun had just started rising over the quiet ranch lake when I stepped outside with my coffee and saw the same calm water that had been part of my life since childhood, and that peaceful moment was the last normal thing I would feel that day. I had bought this ranch years ago with hard-earned money and never imagined anyone could challenge my right to live and enjoy my own land, especially not a homeowners association that lived miles away behind gates and manicured lawns. I stood there frozen, trying to understand how someone could claim there was illegal activity on my private property that had been in my family for generations. As I read further, the details became more ridiculous because the caller said the lake was owned by their community and that I was trespassing on it. My mind raced back to the small cluster of luxury homes built years ago near the edge of my land and how their HOA board had always acted like they owned the world around them. They had sent letters before about noise and about my fence line and even about my dog barking, but this was the first time they had crossed into something this serious. I realized the call had come directly to my own office because I worked for the county and had oversight of emergency call reviews, which meant I was now watching my own life being reported as a crime. The lake was not only a view for me, it was my escape, my therapy, and the place where my dog spent every morning wagging his tail like it was the best day of his life. That morning the air felt heavier than usual, and before I could even take a sip of coffee my phone started vibrating in my pocket with an alert that made my heart pause. The alert was from the local emergency dispatch system, which I had access to through my work, and it said that a caller was reporting illegal activity at my ranch lake and demanding police intervention. I felt a strange mix of anger and disbelief because these people had no idea who they were messing with or how badly this would blow back on them. I walked back inside my cabin and pulled up the live feed of the call details and saw the HOA president's name attached to the complaint. The complaint said I was refusing to leave a community lake and that I had threatened residents, which was a complete lie. I could almost hear her voice in my head, that same tone she used when she once told me my trees blocked her sunset view. The situation felt surreal because while she was probably sipping coffee in her perfect kitchen, I was standing barefoot on my own porch being accused of a crime. I decided not to confront her directly because I wanted everything to be documented the right way, and I wanted the truth to be undeniable. Within minutes, I saw patrol cars being dispatched, and I knew they were headed straight to my ranch. I walked down the gravel path toward the driveway, and my dog followed behind me, sensing something was off. As the first cruiser pulled in, I noticed the officers' faces were serious and alert, like they were expecting trouble. I greeted them calmly and told them this was my property and that I believed there had been a false report filed against me. They asked for my identification, which I handed over without hesitation because I had nothing to hide. The lead officer looked at my ID and then at the cabin behind me and then at the lake, and I could tell something did not add up for him. More cars arrived, and soon there were several officers standing in a loose line near their vehicles, all looking around like they were trying to understand why they had been called here. I explained that I worked for the county and had received the call details myself, and that the complaint came from the HOA next door. That was when their expressions shifted from suspicion to confusion, and then to quiet frustration. One officer asked me if I wanted to file a report for false reporting, and I nodded because at this point it was no longer about me, it was about stopping abuse of the system. We walked over to the edge of the lake where the property markers were clearly visible, and I showed them the survey documents I kept on hand for situations exactly like this. The officers confirmed that the lake was indeed entirely within my property boundaries, and that the HOA had no claim over it whatsoever. While this was happening, my phone buzzed again, and this time it was the HOA president calling me directly. I let it go to voicemail because I wanted everything in writing or recorded through official channels. The officers finished their documentation and assured me that they would be following up with the HOA board immediately. I watched them drive off, feeling both relieved and exhausted because what should have been a peaceful morning had turned into a legal standoff. An hour later, I checked my voicemail and heard the HOA president sounding furious, saying that I had embarrassed her and that I would regret involving the police. I saved the message knowing it would become useful evidence later. That afternoon, I received a formal notice from my own office that an investigation into misuse of emergency services had been opened. The irony was almost too much to handle because the call meant to scare me had instead triggered a process that could cost her thousands in fines. Days passed, and word spread quickly through the community about what had happened, and suddenly the HOA board went silent. No more letters, no more complaints, no more threats about noise or dogs or fences. I later learned through colleagues that the HOA president had tried to argue that she was acting in the best interest of her residents. But the call logs told a different story, showing exaggeration, false statements, and deliberate. The board members started distancing themselves from her almost immediately because no one wanted to be associated with a legal mess like that. In the end, the county issued a heavy fine and a formal warning that any future abuse of emergency services could result in criminal charges. When I returned home that evening after the decision, I walked down to the lake again and watched the sun set behind the trees just like I always had. The water was still calm, my dog was still happy, and for the first time in days I felt the tension leave my body. I realized that some people become so obsessed with control that they forget basic respect for others and for the law. This entire ordeal had started because someone thought they were above the rules and that the system existed only to serve them. What they did not realize was that the same system would protect me when it was used correctly. Now, every time I stand by my lake, I remember that morning not with anger but with a quiet sense of victory. Because they tried to kick me off my own ranch lake, and instead they exposed themselves to the very authority they tried to misuse. And that is a lesson I know they will never forget. The next morning I woke up to the sound of birds over the lake, and for the first time in weeks I did not feel like I had to look over my shoulder because the silence now felt honest again. Later that day, a neighbor from the gated community drove up to my fence looking nervous and said she wanted to apologize for what the HOA president had done, and that many residents were ashamed of how far things had gone. She told me people were resigning from the board and that meetings had turned into shouting matches because no one trusted leadership anymore. I listened quietly, realizing that the damage caused by one selfish decision was now spreading through their entire community. That evening I sat on my porch with my dog resting at my feet, watching the water ripple in the breeze, knowing that no one could ever take this place from me again. That night I looked out over the dark lake and felt a deep sense of peace because the water reflected the stars like nothing bad had ever happened here. I went to sleep knowing that tomorrow would finally be just another quiet day on my ranch where I belong. The morning after everything settled, I took a slow walk around the edge of the lake, breathing in the cold, clean air, and letting the crunch of gravel under my boots remind me that this place was real and still mine, no matter how hard anyone tried to take it away, because this ranch had been built with years of work and sacrifice and memories that no legal threat could ever erase. And as I followed the shoreline, I kept thinking about how close I had come to letting anger take over, and how instead I had trusted the system to reveal the truth and protect what mattered to me most. And with every step I felt lighter, like a heavy storm had finally passed and left behind clear skies that allowed me to see my future again without fear or bitterness or the constant feeling of being watched by people who did not belong here. And when I reached the old wooden dock, I sat down, simple moment was all I had wanted from the beginning, and it was strange to think that someone else had tried to turn this peaceful life into a battlefield simply because they believed their authority extended beyond their gates and across land that was never theirs. And I wondered what it must feel like to live with that kind of entitlement, where you convince yourself that everyone else is an obstacle to your comfort rather than a person with their own rights and history and dreams. And as I sat there, I made a promise to myself that I would never become that kind of person, no matter how much power or influence I might gain through my job or my experience, because I had seen firsthand how destructive that mindset could be, and how quickly it could turn neighbors into enemies and peace into conflict. And over the next few hours, I worked around the ranch, repairing a loose fence board, cleaning the old canoe, and throwing a ball for my dog until my arms ached in the best possible way. And with each small task, I felt like I was reclaiming something that had been threatened, not just my property, but my sense of safety and belonging. And later that afternoon, I drove into town to pick up supplies and noticed how different people treated me now that the story had spread, because strangers nodded at me in the store, and one man even shook my hand, saying he had heard what happened and that I had handled it the right way. And those simple gestures meant more to me than any formal apology from the HOA ever could, because they reminded me that most people still believed in fairness and honesty and common sense. And when I returned home, I found a handwritten letter tucked into my mailbox from one of the HOA residents, who wrote that she had always admired the lake from afar and never imagined the board would go so far as to weaponize emergency services, and she hoped that someday I might forgive the community for what one person had done. And reading her words, board was eventually restructured, and new leadership sent me a formal letter acknowledging my ownership of the lake and promising that no resident would ever bother me again over the issue. And I read that letter standing on the same porch where I had first received the alert that had changed everything, and I smiled, because the porch no longer felt like a battleground, but like what it had always been meant to be, a place to watch the sunrise in silence. And sometimes I imagine what would have happened if I had not worked for the county, or if I had not seen the call come through my own system, and whether the situation would have spiraled into something far uglier, and that thought alone reminds me how fragile peace can be when power is abused, and how important it is for ordinary people to stand up for themselves even when the odds feel stacked against them. And now when visitors come to the ranch and ask about the lake, I tell them the story not with anger but with a calm certainty that this place has survived more than just one misguided phone call, and that as long as I am here it will remain what it has always been, a quiet stretch of water that reflects not only the sky above but the values of the person who calls it home. One evening not long after everything had finally calmed down, I invited a few close friends over to the ranch because I wanted to celebrate the return of normal life and remind myself that this place was meant to be shared with people who respected it. And as they arrived they commented on how beautiful the lake looked under the fading light, and how strange it was that anyone would ever think they could claim something so obviously private. And as we sat around a simple wooden table near the shore talking about work, family, and plans for the coming months, I realized how much stress I had been carrying inside my body without even noticing it, because my shoulders slowly relaxed and my laughter came more easily than it had in weeks. And at one point I caught myself telling the story of the HOA call with a smile instead of the tight knot in my stomach that had once accompanied every detail, and my friends listened in disbelief, shaking their heads at the arrogance of someone who would try to use emergency services as a personal weapon. And one of them said something that stuck with me, which was that power reveals who we really are when we think no one is watching. And I looked out at the lake then, seeing the reflection of our small fire on the water, and thought about how true that was, because the real test of character had not been mine alone but everyone involved, from the officers who treated me fairly to the residents who later apologized, to the board members who chose to distance themselves from a lie, and even to the woman who had started it all, because in the end she had revealed more about herself than she ever could have imagined. And as the night grew colder we wrapped ourselves in jackets and kept talking long after the stars had filled the sky. And when everyone eventually left I stood alone by the lake again, feeling a deep sense of gratitude that this chapter of my life had ended not in bitterness but in understanding and resolve to protect what mattered most with patience. Challenged, and as I stood there watching the mist rise off the lake, I made a promise that this place would always be a refuge, not just for me, but for anyone who came here with respect, because in a world where people are so quick to draw lines and claim territory, it felt more important than ever to protect a space defined by fairness and humility. And when the sun finally broke over the horizon, I felt something settle inside my chest, a quiet confidence that no matter what new challenge might appear at my door, I would face it the same way I had faced this one, with clarity, integrity, and the unshakable knowledge that my home was not something anyone else could take from me with a single phone call or a moment of misplaced authority.